news footage from the mountains, news updates from the mining communities of Pennsylvania. Brought to you by the Lady Valley Consolidated Coal Company. It's almost Memorial Day, and the Centralia Committee are hard at work organizing the yearly celebrations. The American Legion will once again be marching from cemetery to cemetery, firing off volleys to honor those who made the ultimate sacrifice. But first, hard choices have to be made about the town dump which comes close to the Oddfellows Cemetery. The town council have decided it's time to burn the rubbish dump to clean it up in time for the big weekend. May 27th, 1962, the local fire chief and some brave volunteers headed to the town dump to burn away the rubbish and leave the cemetery looking clean and smart. Thanks to them, Centralia has a great weekend to look forward to. Happy Memorial Day, Centralia, and here's to many more.
On May 27th, 1962, the rubbish dump that was in the old strip mine excavated by one Edward Whitney back in 1935 was burned. It was bordered one of the graveyards or cemeteries on the outskirts of Centralia, which was a small mining town in eastern Pennsylvania. Firefighters were present, and the fire was later extinguished. A few days later, George Jones, who was the president of the trustees of the cemetery, reported smoke rising from beyond the eastern fence. The night of May 29th, several hoses were connected to local hydrants, and water was run from around 9 p.m. to around about 2 o'clock in the morning. The fire flared up again in the week of June 4th, and a few days later, a discovery was made. There was a hole in the wall of the old mine that was about 15 feet long and a few feet high. For extremely obvious reasons, old mines have to be filled with incombustible material before they could be used for anything else. This hole had been missed, and the hole led directly to the warren of mines that went underneath the town. Like many places across the entire state, the earth underneath Centralia and in the hills all around it was filled with valuable, highly flammable anthracite coal. By mid-July, steam was seen rising from the ground, and a state mine inspector was sent for along with gas detection equipment. From the amount of carbon dioxide registering on the equipment, the state mine inspector concluded that the fire had indeed spread to the abandoned mines. By the spring of 1965, from the edge of town, Centralia residents could see an unearthly glow at night over the pit that had been excavated to try and dig out the fire. Those who ventured to the edge saw blue flame and red hot rock. By 1968, boreholes that were drilled within 25 feet of residents' homes were registering temperatures somewhere between 700 and 900 degrees. By 1976, when the journalist David DeKok started covering the story of Centralia, residents were able to measure the carbon monoxide coming out of the boreholes at levels which could kill you. By 1978, families were starting to admit that they would be willing to sell their homes and move, as the only plans that state and local officials could come up with at this point would necessarily involve demolishing residences. By 1979, people who lived in the town were being taken to hospital suffering from oxygen-deprived atmospheres inside their homes. By the 1980s, children who still lived in the town were reporting headaches and nausea at school, and the number of children who were diagnosed with asthma skyrocketed. The Office of Surface Mining, or OSM, reported that emergency abatement measures were becoming necessary to prevent an imminent catastrophic event. On Valentine's Day, 1981, 12-year-old Todd Dombowski was out and about in town when the ground opened up under his feet, and an enormous cloud of steam and fire broke to the surface. He was pulled out of a sinkhole that was eventually measured to be 150 feet deep. In 1984, after years of campaigning from Centralia residents, the United States Congress approved a $42 million relocation effort. The majority of families took the buyout and moved away, and a small handful remained residing in the town. By 1992, Bob Casey, the governor of Pennsylvania, enacted eminent domain over all remaining properties, and the final legal appeals against this were lost by residents by 2012. By the following year, the 7 remaining residents had come to a legal agreement that would allow them to live out their days in the town before their properties would be purchased and then demolished. Centralia is now deserted. It's been annihilated. But when you start to try and think about when and why all of this happened, it becomes a little bit harder to disentangle, because that small moment, that decision from 1962, is connected to so many other crucial events and moments through history. Maybe it was when the final properties were demolished and people agreed to be relocated. Maybe it was when the decision was taken to burn the rubbish dump in advance of the Memorial Day weekend back in 1962. Maybe it was when the locusts-run colliery opened in 1856. Maybe it was the latter half of the 19th century when the insatiable appetite for coal drove thousands of men into the mines and hollowed out the ground beneath Centralia, at the same time as sending stacks of smoke into the atmosphere from across England, Europe, and the United States in what Andreas Malm calls the fossil economy. Maybe it was 1830 when Stephen Girard, a Pennsylvania banker, bought 69 nice tracts of land for $30,000 and discovered the first traces of anthracite coal in the hills. Maybe it was 1749 when the indigenous tribes that were living on the land were forced to sell it to colonial agents for just $500. Colonialism, deforestation, the exploitation of working class labour are all tied up with this mine fire from 1962, which is in itself both a product and consequence of the ways in which we have indelibly altered the natural world. In that story of a small town in eastern Pennsylvania, there is a snapshot of our wider shared condition of what it means to live through the seismic changes of contemporary capitalism. The thing about the story of Centralia is that it shows that things don't end all at once. Annihilation is something that you live through. Think of Centralia from the 60s to the 80s. People grew up there. People had children there. People sent their kids to school there. And all of that makes me wonder, how do you live when the very earth beneath your feet is on fire? How do you live with annihilation? To quote the eminent climatologist Dr. Odradek,
and I really don't think we need a scientist. I think we need a priest.
maybe it's not a priest that we need. Maybe it's a story. It's not new facts that we need. We've known the facts for a long, long time. Charles Babbage was writing back in 1835 about the dangers of too much carbonic acid being added to the atmosphere. It isn't new facts that we need. This isn't a problem of knowledge, but a problem of politics and imagination. But as Amitav Ghosh puts it in their book, The Great Derangement, nobody really seems to want to write stories about changes to the climate. Not just because it's hard, but the sheer strangeness, the unfamiliarity, the drastic and almost apocalyptic changes that people have been living through would make a realist literary narrative seem contrived. No one would believe it. Here, then, is the irony of the realist novel. The very gestures with which it conjures up reality are actually a concealment of the real. What this means in practice is that the calculus of probability that is deployed within the imaginary world of a novel is not the same as that which obtains outside it. This is why it is commonly said, if this were in a novel, no one would believe it. Within the pages of a novel, an event that is only slightly improbable in real life, say an unexpected encounter with a long-lost childhood friend, may seem wildly unlikely. The writer will have to work hard to make it appear persuasive.
If that is true of a small fluke of chance, consider how much harder a writer would have to work to set up a scene that is wildly improbable even in real life. For example, a scene in which a character is walking down a road at the precise moment when it's hit by an unheard of weather phenomenon. To introduce such happenings into a novel is in fact to court eviction from the mansion in which serious fiction has long been in residence. It is to risk banishment to the humbler dwellings that surround the manor house, those generic outhouses that were once known by names such as the Gothic, and have now come to be called fantasy, horror, and science fiction.
As Timothy Morton puts it, isn't it the case that the effect that's delivered to us in the cyclone or the oil slick is something uncanny? The world that we live in has become strange, weird, uncanny, even horrifying. So if that's the case, maybe we don't need another recounting of the facts, but something far weirder. Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer is a 2014 novel that was adapted in 2018 by Alex Garland into a film starring, among others, Natalie Portman. It is a strange and often unsettling text, but it's interesting because maybe it offers new ways of thinking through relating to the world when it's become a radically different one. The book follows 4 women known only by their professions as they investigate a strange area called Area X, which a few decades previously was subject to some sort of environmental cataclysm, which has changed the environment into this ongoing horror show of beauty and biodiversity. A strange government entity known as the Southern Reach has taken control over Area X and has been sending expeditions into the area to try and figure out what's been going on. None has gone well. One previous expedition ended in a hail of gunfire, one ended in a mass suicide event, and the 11th expedition ended in a mass cancer epidemic. The biologist and the rest of the team will be part of the 12th expedition. The biologist is also the text's narrator, and they're this intensely private person. They don't like to give away anything about themselves, not even their name, and they have no interest in the personal or private details about the rest of the team that they're on this expedition with. Throughout the entire novel, there's this determined attempt to disrupt human-centered ways of knowing. In a flashback, the biologist talks of finding a tidal pool late at night, and in the pool they see this species of starfish colloquially known as the Destroyer of Worlds. Looking at this creature precipitates an intense intellectual moment of crisis.
The longer I stared at it, the less comprehensible the creature became. The more it became something alien to me, the more I had a sense that I knew nothing at all about nature, about ecosystems. There was something about my mood and its dark glow that eclipsed sense, that made me see this creature, which had indeed been assigned a place in the taxonomy catalog, studied and described, irreducible down to any of that. And if I kept looking, I knew that ultimately I would have to admit I knew less than nothing about myself as well, whether that was a lie or the truth.
In the weird world that we live in, even knowledge about knowledge has become hard to hold on to. Ideas about the nature of nature in the novel become unstable. They start to unspool, reflecting the way that our own understanding of the natural world that surrounds us has become more fluid as we start to see more clearly the seismic changes wrought by climate change and all of the interrelated issues that link to it. The biologist in the novel has an encounter with a strange human-alien composite creature, which triggers an epistemological crisis even more intense than the one triggered by that starfish in the tidal pool. It leads to, as the novel puts it, revelation and paralysis. But the thing is, you can't stay still forever. when everything you thought you knew about the world changes, when the very earth beneath you is on fire, something has to give. What has to give in the case of the biologist is a series of attachments. The attachment to living in a city, or living with others, living with a spouse, living with an individualist notion of autonomy and freedom. To quote Fionnuala Prendergast from their article on the novel,
by asking us to subsume human relations into largely non-human environmental communities, Annihilation demands a sacrifice from us. Though not an individualist, the biologist values her ability to relate without being absorbed. Reading her husband's journal, she realizes she could have met him part way and retained her sovereignty. She could have had the same intimate relationship with him that she has with tidal pools and fungi, a comparison that gestures towards the practical, emotional, and ethical improvements that placing her marriage in the context of a larger human, non-human community might have occasioned. Annihilation examines the ways in which demoting human relationships from the high rung they occupy in our hierarchy of value, though it would require sacrifice, might, in some ways, more fully actualize the potential goodness of all our affiliations.
what if, instead of looking at the world as a series of territories that we could own, or resources that we could use, or materials that we could funnel into constant production, we understood it instead as a larger series of interlinked networks to which we are connected, bound up with? In their book, Capitalism in the Web of Life, Jason Moore puts it that the idea of cheap nature, think of the inexhaustible streams of coal underneath Centralia, for example, is over. And so moving to something new depends upon us being able to think past this Cartesian dualism between nature on the one hand and society on the other. There's a danger when thinking about this kind of thing that can easily lapse into a sort of naive green utopianism, but Annihilation shows that when it comes to rethinking our place in the world, it can be a terrifying experience. However, as the biologist discovers in Area X, it can be beautiful as well, and can lead us into new modes of existence. Indelibly changed by their experiences, the biologist at the end chooses to remain in Area X, chooses to try to live in a brand new way. In their book, How Forests Think, the anthropologist Eduardo Kohn tells a story about their time with indigenous tribes in Ecuador. Preparing to camp at night, they're told by one of the tribe that they should sleep face up, because if a jaguar comes by, the jaguar will recognize you and will move on, but if you sleep with your face down, the animal will think that you're prey and will attack. Nature looks back at us, and Annihilation shows that this is a deeply uncanny experience, but it also has the potential to radically alter for the better the way that we exist and relate to the world around us. What would that look like in a practical sense? Well, if you've come to the end of a YouTube video looking for answers to anthropogenic climate change and centuries of capital accumulation, then thank you, I suppose. But practical solutions to the problem of anthropogenic climate change require a massive rethinking of political vision in line with the ethical imperative to rethink human-centered modes of existence that Annihilation tries to outline. Searching for a familiar solution to the problem elides the fact that the end of the world as we know it is not the end of the world. At the end of his book, Old Gods, New Enigmas, the American historian Mike Davis essentially stages an argument with himself about what can be done in the wake of the catastrophic alterations and ongoing disaster that is climate change. The first half of the chapter outlines all of the facts, the increasingly dire situation, and the second half tries to find the possibilities for a good outcome. We know the facts of the situation, but the possibility of hope depends not on a greater knowledge of the facts, but on the imaginative capacity to think of what might be possible in the wake of annihilation. To quote Davis,
"Only a return to explicitly utopian thinking can clarify the minimal conditions for the preservation of human solidarity in face of convergent planetary crises. I think I understand what the Italian Marxist architects Tafuri and Tauco meant when they cautioned against a regression to the utopian, but to raise our imaginations to the challenge of the Anthropocene, we must be able to envision alternative configurations of agents, practices, and social relations. And this requires, in turn, that we suspend the politico-economic assumptions that chain us to the present. If this sounds like a sentimental call to the barricades, an echo from the classrooms and streets and studios of 40 years ago, then so be it. Because on the basis of the evidence before us, taking a realist view of the human prospect, like seeing Medusa's head, would simply turn us into stone."